The guard leaned closer and whispered words that froze my blood. "I saw your son put something in your juice." Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do me a quick favor. If this story catches your attention, drop a comment below and let me know what you would have done in my place. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this one. Stories about family, betrayal, and the secrets we never expect to face. The restaurant was warm, dimly lit and filled with the low hum of conversations. Cutlery chimed against porcelain plates, and soft jazz played in the background. The scent of roasted garlic and buttery sauces floated in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of wine. To anyone else, it was a pleasant evening. To me, however, the weight in my chest made every detail sharper, heavier. I felt like I was sitting at the edge of a cliff, though I couldn't quite tell why yet. My son sat across from me, his hands folded neatly on the table. His expression was polite, practiced, too practiced, like someone performing a role they'd rehearsed countless times. His eyes didn't rest on mine for more than a second. Each glance he gave me felt like a mask, a flash of something familiar and then gone, replaced with that detached stare. The waiter approached, setting down glasses of water and a bottle of wine I hadn't ordered. My son thanked him in a voice so smooth it startled me. It wasn't the voice of the boy I had raised, the one who used to run through our hallway barefoot, laughing so hard he'd stumble into the walls. It was colder, more deliberate. As we sat there, I noticed the way other diners seemed to glance at him, quick, curious looks, as if they sensed something about him that didn't belong. And yet outwardly he was everything one might want to see. Handsome, composed, successful. The kind of person strangers envy without knowing why. But I knew better, because behind that calm surface was a history, one that had carved scars into me and everyone else who had dared to love him. My son had always been difficult. Not just rebellious, not just strong-willed. There was something sharper about him, something that cut deeper. I remember when he was 12 and I found the neighbor's dog limping in our yard. My son was nearby holding a stick, his face unreadable. When I asked him what had happened, he only shrugged and said it wanted to see how much pain it could handle. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at his bedroom door, wondering what kind of person was growing behind it. Teachers called me in more times than I could count. He was brilliant, yes, but manipulative. He knew how to twist people's words, how to pit classmates against each other, how to make teachers doubt themselves. One of them once told me, "Your son doesn't just break rules. He studies people. He looks at them the way a scientist might look at insects." And yet, there were moments, fleeting, disarming moments, when he would smile at me with a softness that melted every doubt I carried. It was those moments that kept me hoping, kept me trying. A hug here, a whispered "I love you" there, always just enough to keep me tethered to the idea that maybe, just maybe. He wasn't as dark as the rest of the world saw him, but as he grew older, those moments became rarer. He learned to hide behind layers of charm, to use kindness as a tool rather than a gift. People outside our home adored him. They called him magnetic. I called him dangerous, which brings me back to that restaurant that night when the guard leaned toward me, with a face as pale as the moon. His whisper cut through the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses. "I saw your son put something in your juice." At first I thought I had misheard him. My son was scrolling through his phone, his face calm, as if he were oblivious to the storm that had just crashed into me. My hands trembled under the table, my heart thundering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I glanced at the glass in front of me. The wine glistened red under the soft light, smooth and inviting. For a second, I thought about how easy it would be to lift it, to drink, to never question anything. But the guard's words wrapped around me like chains. I looked at my son again. His eyes finally met mine, and there was something there, something too knowing, too expectant. It was as though he was waiting for me to take that sip, and that was the moment I realized tonight wasn't just dinner. Tonight was a test. I wish I could tell you that what the guard whispered shocked me, because it was unthinkable, because it was so far removed from who my son was. But the truth? The truth is that some part of me had been expecting something like this for years. It was the kind of dread that doesn't come from nowhere. It grows piece by piece, carved by 1,000 smaller cruelties. My son was not born a monster. At least that's what I tell myself. I remember the way he looked the day he was born. Small, fragile, clinging to me with tiny fists, eyes closed against the light of the world. I thought he was a miracle. I thought I was holding the best part of myself, but even in his earliest years there were glimpses, shadows in the sunlight. When he was 3, I watched him push another child off a swing, not because he wanted the swing, but because he wanted to see what would happen. He watched the other boy cry with a strange fascination, as though it was entertainment. When I scolded him, he stared at me, unblinking, as if he didn't understand why I was upset. By the time he reached his teenage years, his cruelty had sharpened into something more deliberate. Words became his favorite weapon. He had this uncanny ability to find someone's deepest insecurity and then press on it until they broke. I once overheard him tell his cousin, a girl who struggled with her weight, that no one would ever love her unless she starved herself. She laughed it off at the time, but I later found her crying in the bathroom. And me? I wasn't spared either. He'd twist my attempts at parenting into traps. If I punished him, he'd act out worse. If I ignored him, he'd accuse me of neglect. If I tried to hug him, sometimes he'd lean into it. Other times he'd go stiff, cold, like a stranger tolerating unwanted contact. Neighbors and teachers were divided about him. Some adored him, said he was charming, gifted, polite. Others warned me that he had a dark streak. One teacher even pulled me aside once, lowering her voice as if afraid he might hear. "There's something about your son. Something I can't explain. He doesn't just misbehave. He studies people, uses them, like he's running experiments. At home, the experiments were always on me. There was one night I'll never forget. I had come home late from work, exhausted, and found a note on the table. It simply read, 'I'm fine. Don't look for me.' My heart nearly stopped. I searched the neighborhood, called his friends, even called the police. Hours later, just as dawn broke, he walked through the door, calm as ever, holding a bag of chips. When I screamed at him, demanded to know where he had been, he smiled and said, 'Now you know what it feels like to care too much.' He was 14. That was the first time I truly understood. He didn't just want freedom, he wanted control. He wanted me to feel the panic, the desperation, the helplessness. And once he saw how much power he had over me, he never forgot it. So when I sat across from him in that restaurant years later, and the guard whispered his warning about the juice, it didn't feel impossible. It felt like the final act of a play that had been running for decades. My eyes lingered on the glass. The wine caught the light like a pool of blood. My hand twitched, almost reaching for it, almost giving in. And then I remembered every smirk, every cruel trick, every time he had made me doubt myself, and yet there was still that other part of me, the part that remembered the little boy with scraped knees and messy hair, running to me when he was scared of thunderstorms. The part of me that still wanted to believe there was good inside him, buried beneath the cold exterior. Was I paranoid? Was the guard mistaken? Maybe my son hadn't slipped anything into the drink. Maybe this was all in my head, colored by years of fear. But then I looked at him. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. He was just watching me, with an intensity that made the world around us fade away. His fingers tapped lightly against the table, an impatient rhythm. His eyes flicked to the glass, then back to me, then back to the glass again. It wasn't my imagination. He wanted me to drink it, my breath caught in my throat. The jazz music blurred into noise, the laughter of strangers into static. It was just me, him, and the glass between us. That was the moment I knew I had to make a choice. I could have done the obvious thing. I could have pushed the glass away, stood up, and walked out of the restaurant forever. That would have been the safe choice, the rational one. But something in me snapped that night. After years of being toyed with, after years of feeling like a puppet dangling on strings only he could pull, I realized I didn't want to run anymore. So instead of avoiding the glass, I leaned forward, rested my hand on its stem, and smiled. A deliberate, calm smile. His eyes lit up. Just slightly, but I saw it. He thought he had me. I raised the glass slowly, watching the red liquid swirl inside. And then, without breaking eye contact, I set it down on his side of the table. "You first," I said. My voice didn't tremble the way I thought it would. It came out steady, almost casual, like we were playing a game of cards. For the first time that evening, his mask slipped. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, so quick most people wouldn't have noticed. But I noticed. He let out a soft laugh, the kind that's meant to dismiss tension, but I could hear the edge in it. "Paranoid, aren't you?" he said, pushing the glass gently back toward me. "Maybe," I replied, "but humor me." The table between us became a battlefield, the wine glass our weapon. He slid it forward. I slid it back. To anyone else in the restaurant, we might have looked like a mother and son joking with each other, teasing. But underneath it there was no warmth, only calculation. "Why would I ever hurt you?" he asked, tilting his head, his voice dripping with feigned innocence. "Why indeed," I said. My smile stayed, but inside my pulse pounded like a war drum. The waiter approached to ask if everything was all right, but my son waved him off with that same practiced charm, the charm that made strangers adore him. The waiter hesitated, glancing at me, then walked away. I wanted to scream for help, to confess everything right then, but something in my son's gaze held me in place. This was no longer about the drink. This was about control, about who would bend first. So I did something even more unexpected. I reached for the glass again, lifted it halfway to my lips and stopped. His eyes widened, just a fraction. "Cheers," I whispered. Then, in a sudden motion, I turned the glass around and held it to his lips. My hand was steady, stronger than I imagined it could be. "If there's nothing wrong with it," I said softly, "then you won't mind." For a moment I thought he might resist, that he might shove the glass away, that the mask would fall completely. But instead he leaned back in his chair, studying me, calculating. Finally he smirked. "You've gotten bold," he murmured. The silence stretched. My hand was still holding the glass, hovering near him. My arm began to ache, but I didn't let it drop. Not until I saw his expression shift again. He leaned forward, took the stem from my hand and lifted the glass himself. Slowly, deliberately, he swirled the liquid, sniffed it, and then he drank. Every second felt like a century. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. I watched the glass lower back to the table. He exhaled, calm, unbothered, and smirked again. Was it working? Had the guard been right? Or, more terrifying still, was this another manipulation, another experiment designed to watch me unravel? The longer I sat there, the more I felt the walls closing in. I could almost hear the echo of his childhood laughter, the way he used to tug at my hand in grocery stores begging for candy. Those echoes twisted with the man in front of me, the man who might have poisoned me or himself just to prove a point. I wanted to ask him why. Why go this far? Why turn life into a stage where love and cruelty blurred into one endless performance? But I didn't, because some part of me feared the answer. Instead, I pressed my hands against the table to steady myself and said, "You scare me." The words slipped out before I could catch them. For a moment, silence engulfed the table. His knife hovered mid-air, his fork still piercing a piece of steak. Then slowly, deliberately, he set them both down. "Good," he whispered. The single word shattered me. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruelly grinned. It was whispered almost reverently. Like it was the outcome he had been working toward all along. That was the moment I knew the dinner could not continue as it was. Something had to give. Something had to break. And as the restaurant's lights glowed warmer and the music swelled around us, I realized the decision was mine. Would I continue playing his game, letting him dictate the rules? Or would I do something so unexpected, so uncharacteristic, that it might shift the balance once and for all? I placed my fork down carefully, aligning it with the knife, my hand steadier than I felt inside. My son's eyes narrowed, curious, intrigued. This was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming something I had lost long ago. My power, my voice, my right to live without fear of the boy I had brought into this world. I inhaled deeply, bracing myself for what would come next. I had spent years swallowing fear, pretending his cruelty was a phase, convincing myself he would change. But sitting there, staring into the eyes of the boy I once cradled in my arms, I felt something inside me snap. I could not be silent anymore. I pushed my chair back, the sound of wood scraping against tile cutting through the hum of the restaurant. Conversations faltered around us. People turned their heads, curious, annoyed. My son's eyes flickered with interest, as if he were watching the opening move of a new game. "Do you think this is funny?" I asked, my voice steady but louder than I intended. "Do you think fear is a prize to win?" A couple at the next table glanced at each other, then back at us. A waiter hesitated near the bar, unsure whether to intervene. My son leaned forward, his smirk barely visible. "Lower your voice, Mother," he whispered. "You're embarrassing yourself. No, I said louder this time. For years I've let you make me feel small. For years I've let you twist every kindness into weakness. But not tonight. Not here. The words spilled out like a flood I couldn't stop. The weight of them pressed against the air, filling the space between us. My hands trembled, not with fear this time, but with fury. You want me to drink poison? Fine. You want me to doubt my own mind? Fine. But here's the truth, I will not let you control me anymore. The room had gone silent now. Forks were suspended mid-air, glasses hovered above lips. Strangers stared openly, drawn into a drama they didn't understand but couldn't look away from. My son tilted his head, studying me with an unsettling calm. And then, in a voice low enough that only I could hear, he said, "You're finally interesting." I didn't know what he meant by that. I only knew that the words chilled me more than anything else. And then I did something no one, least of all my son, expected. I reached for the glass of wine again. My hand was steady this time, my decision sharp and irreversible. But instead of lifting it to my lips, I stood up, raised the glass high above my head, and slammed it down against the floor. The sound of shattering crystal exploded through the restaurant. Wine splashed across the tiles, dark red spreading like blood. Gasps filled the room. A child at a nearby table cried out. Every eye turned toward us. My chest heaved as I stood there, shards of glass glittering at my feet. My son's mask faltered. For the first time in years, he looked unsettled, not amused, not calculating, but genuinely caught off guard. "You don't get to decide how this ends," I said, my voice ringing clear. Louder than I thought possible. Two waiters rushed over, their faces pale. "Is everything all right here?" one asked nervously. I looked straight at them and said, "No, it's not." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. My son leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms slowly, deliberately. The smirk was gone now. In its place was something colder, anger restrained like a predator deciding whether to strike. "Mother," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "you've made a scene." "Good," I replied. "Everyone should see you for what you are." A murmur rippled through the room. People whispered, speculated. The guard who had warned me earlier stepped closer, his hand resting subtly on the back of a chair, ready in case things escalated. For the first time, my son was not in control. The eyes of the restaurant, dozens of strangers, were witnesses now. He couldn't charm them all. He couldn't twist their memories, and I saw it, the faintest flicker of rage in his expression, a loss of power he couldn't disguise, the clattering of dishes, the murmurs of strangers, the weight of his stare, it all collided inside me. My knees threatened to buckle, but I forced myself to stay upright. I had broken the glass. I had broken the silence. And now something had shifted forever. But what I didn't know, what none of us in that room could have predicted, was that the real twist was still waiting. Just beyond the corner of that night, for a long, breathless moment, the restaurant was frozen in silence. The shattered glass sparkled across the floor like a warning, red wine spreading between the shards like blood. All eyes were on us, on him, on me, and for the first time in years I felt something shift, but my son was not one to be cornered. He stood slowly, the legs of his chair scraping against the tile. The motion was deliberate, measured, designed to reclaim control. His gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with anyone bold enough to stare, and one by one the onlookers looked away, intimidated by something they couldn't quite name. Then he turned back to me. "Mother," he said softly, his voice carrying a razor's edge, "you've embarrassed yourself." "No," I replied, my throat dry but my words firm. "I've exposed you." The guard who had warned me earlier stepped closer now, his hand hovering near my arm as if to steady me. "Ma'am," he whispered, "do you want me to call someone?" "The police?" I opened my mouth to answer, but my son cut in, his voice suddenly louder, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Do you all see this?" he said, gesturing toward me with an exaggerated sweep of his arm. "My own mother thinks I'm trying to kill her." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few people shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with the accusation. To them he looked calm, articulate, almost pitiful. To them I was the one trembling, unsteady, spilling accusations, with no proof but a broken glass on the floor. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was shifting the narrative, painting himself as the victim. I clenched my fists, desperate to speak, but the weight of so many eyes made my tongue heavy. My son saw it. He thrived on it. Paranoia, he said smoothly, shrugging at the strangers. It runs in the family. Laughter, uneasy, scattered, broke from a few tables. The embarrassment seared my skin. For a moment I thought I had lost the fragile ground I had just gained. But then the guard spoke up, his voice sharp and clear. I saw him put something in her drink. The words sliced through the room like lightning. Gasps erupted. Chairs shifted. A wave of tension swept across the restaurant. My son's face didn't crumble. He didn't panic. He simply froze, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening, just enough for me to notice. And then he smiled. That's a serious accusation, he said evenly, his gaze locked on the guard. Are you prepared to back it up? The guard straightened his shoulders. I don't lie. For the first time all evening, my son's charm cracked. The smirk wavered. His nostrils flared, and beneath the calm surface I saw it, raw fury. He turned back to me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. You think they'll believe him over me, over us? I don't need them to believe, I whispered. I only need you to know I'm not afraid anymore. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Waiters huddled near the bar. Diners whispered behind raised hands. A manager stepped forward cautiously, glancing between my son, the guard, and me. Is there a problem here? The manager asked. Yes, I said, my voice louder than before. My son tried to poison me. A collective gasp. A wine glass dropped somewhere in the distance. The manager's face paled. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to... But my son interrupted, his tone icy. Don't you dare. The words weren't shouted, but they carried such force that the manager actually took a step back. My son's presence filled the room, demanding obedience the way a king might command his court. And for a heartbeat, I felt the fear return, the old fear, the kind that lived in my bones. But then I remembered the sound of the glass shattering, the look on his face when his control slipped. I straightened my shoulders. Call the police, I told the manager. My son's eyes locked onto mine, blazing with something I had never seen so clearly before. Hatred. Not disappointment, not annoyance. Pure, unfiltered hatred. And then, just as suddenly, he smiled. All right, he said lightly, as though this were all a joke. Call them. Let's see how this plays out. As the manager hurried away, my heart thundered in my chest. The guard stayed close, his presence a fragile shield. My son sat back down calmly, folding his hands on the table as if nothing unusual had happened. But the calm was an illusion. I could see the tension in the way his fingers pressed against each other, the way his jaw ticked. Something was coming. I could feel it, because my son was not a man who lost gracefully, and I had just forced him into a corner. The restaurant had gone eerily quiet. Every sound, the clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, the hum of the jazz band, had dissolved into silence. All that remained was the pounding of my heartbeat and the steady, unreadable stare of my son. Minutes later, the police arrived. 2 officers stepped through the entrance, their uniforms sharp under the restaurant's soft lighting. The manager rushed to them, whispering urgently, pointing toward our table. I thought I would feel relief. I thought the sight of authority would loosen the knots in my chest. Instead, dread sank deeper into me, heavy and suffocating, because I knew better than anyone that my son had a gift. A terrible, dangerous gift. He could make anyone believe him. The officers approached, their expressions a careful blend of professionalism and curiosity. We received a report, one said, his eyes flicking between me, my son, and the shattered glass at our feet. What seems to be the problem here? Before I could speak, my son leaned forward, his voice steady, his posture impeccable. It's a misunderstanding, he said smoothly. My mother, she isn't well. She thought I put something in her drink. He gestured to the guard. This man claims he saw me, but look around. I've been here in plain sight. Everyone's watching. Do you really think I would do something so reckless in public? His words were like silk, weaving a narrative so convincing that even I, who knew the truth, felt its pull. The officer's eyes narrowed, skeptical but not dismissive. They turned to me. Ma'am, is that true? Do you believe your son tried to harm you? Yes, I said firmly, though my voice shook. He put something in my drink. The guard saw it, The guard nodded, stepping closer. I did. I was near the bar. I saw him reach across and pour something from his pocket into her glass. For a moment I thought that would be enough. That the testimony of a witness, a stranger with no reason to lie, would tip the balance. But then my son did something I hadn't anticipated. He laughed. Not a mocking laugh, not cruel. It was warm, genuine, disarming, the kind of laugh that made people want to laugh with him. He shook his head, wiping at his eyes as though the absurdity of it all had moved him nearly to tears. "Do you hear this?" he said, turning to the officers, then gesturing toward the diners. "My own mother, the woman I love more than anyone, thinks I would poison her. And why? Because a guard claims he saw something he couldn't possibly have seen from across the room." The diners stirred, whispering among themselves. Some nodded. Some frowned. But I could feel the tide shifting. My son lowered his gaze, his voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "She's been unwell for a while, paranoia, anxiety. I've tried to help, but she refuses. Tonight I brought her here for dinner, hoping to calm her. And now this." The officers glanced at each other. Doubt flickered across their faces. My stomach twisted. He was doing it again, spinning the story, twisting the truth, until even reality bent to his will. "No," I said, my voice cracking. "He's lying. Please, you have to believe me." One of the officers raised a hand gently. "Ma'am, let's stay calm. Do you have any proof? Anything at all?" My mouth went dry. Proof. The wine was gone, shattered on the floor. The only evidence was the guard's word, and mine. Against his charm, against his composure, that didn't feel like enough. But before I could answer, my son spoke again. His tone shifted, becoming softer, more intimate. "Mother," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Why are you doing this?" "After everything I've done for you." The words pierced me like knives. He said them not as a defense, not as a denial, but as an accusation. As if I were the betrayer, as if I were the one. Before the officer could respond, my son reached calmly into his jacket. My breath caught. I thought he would pull out a vial, proof of his guilt. But instead, he produced a small folded envelope. He laid it on the table between us. "You want to know what this is?" he asked softly. His eyes burned into mine. The officers looked at him warily. "What is it?" He pushed the envelope toward me. "Open it." "Go on." My fingers trembled as I reached for it. Slowly, I unfolded the paper inside, and when I saw what it was, the air left my lungs. It wasn't poison. It wasn't drugs. It was a letter, written in my handwriting, signed by me. A letter I had written years ago and forgotten, when grief had swallowed me whole and I had thought about ending my own life. A suicide note. The room spun. My vision blurred. I had written those words in a moment of despair, hidden them away, never intending anyone else to see. And yet here it was in his hands, laid bare for strangers to judge. The officers glanced at each other again. Their suspicion softened. The diners whispered louder, their sympathy shifting, not for me, but for him. For the dutiful son burdened by a paranoid, unstable mother. And my son. He smiled, not wide, not gloating, just a faint, knowing smile. Because in one move he had turned the entire room against me. I stared at the paper in my hands, as if it were a live wire. My own handwriting, curved, delicate, unmistakable, glared back at me. Those words, written in a moment of darkness years ago, now lay between us like a confession I had never meant to make. "I can't do this anymore. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Please forgive me." The note trembled in my hands. I could feel every eye in the restaurant boring into me, every whisper curling through the air like smoke. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their suspicion dissolving into pity. My son sat back in his chair, his face composed, but his eyes glinting with something I couldn't name. Triumph? Sadness? Both? "Mother," he said gently, his voice soft enough to sound like concern. "Do you remember writing that?" My throat closed. I couldn't speak. "This is what she does," he said, turning to the officers. "She spirals. She writes things, she hides them. She accuses me of things I haven't done. She's not well?" A ripple of sympathy swept across the room. Diners who had been glaring at him moments ago now looked at me as though I were the unstable one. A few shook their heads, muttering under their breath. My heart hammered in my chest. It was happening again. He was rewriting the story, shaping the narrative with his hands like clay. And once more everyone believed him, but inside me something shifted. This time, instead of collapsing, I felt the burn of rage rising in my chest. I had written that note, yes. But I had survived it. I had clawed my way back from that darkness. And now he was using it against me. Where did you get this? I asked, my voice hoarse. He tilted his head, feigning innocence. You left it in a drawer. I found it years ago. I've been keeping it. Just in case. Just in case what? In case you needed help. The words were wrapped in concern, but they landed like a slap. You're lying, I whispered. He raised an eyebrow, leaning closer. Am I? The officers cleared their throats. One of them stepped forward carefully. Ma'am, he said, his voice patient but firm. Do you have any evidence your son tried to harm you tonight? Other than your suspicion? I looked around the room. The guard stood nearby, his jaw tight, but even he seemed shaken by the sudden shift. I saw him, the guard said again, though quieter this time. I swear I did. My son spread his hands, palms up, a picture of calm. Search me, he said. Search everything. You won't find anything. One of the officers nodded and began patting him down. I watched, my breath caught in my throat as they searched his pockets, his jacket, his sleeves. Nothing. No vial. No powder. No trace of poison, just the letter. The officers stepped back, exchanging glances. There's nothing here, one of them murmured. The room's energy shifted again. I could feel it like a tide receding. People who had been on the edge of their seats were now leaning back, shaking their heads, whispering words like crazy and overreaction, and in the middle of it all sat my son, his hands folded neatly, his expression serene, but I saw the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He had planned this. All of it. I clutched the letter, my nails digging into the paper. You knew I would confront you, I whispered. You knew. He smiled faintly. I know you better than you know yourself. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He did know me, my weaknesses, my triggers, my fears. He had spent his life studying me the way a scientist studies a specimen. But as I looked at him now, surrounded by strangers who believed his story, I felt something new rise in me. Not fear, not despair, resolve. Because for the first time I saw the edges of his game. And if I could see the edges, maybe, just maybe, I could step outside it. I folded the letter carefully and set it back on the table. My hands were steady now, my voice clear when I spoke. You're right, I said softly. I wrote it. Years ago. I was hurting. But I survived. I am still here. My son blinked, surprised by the calm in my tone. And I'm done, I continued. I'm done letting you decide who I am. I'm done being your experiment. A murmur rippled through the room again. The officers straightened, sensing a shift. Even the guard seemed to stand taller. For a heartbeat, my son's mask cracked. His smirk faded. His eyes narrowed, and I realized something. He wasn't untouchable. He leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. Careful, Mother. You're treading on thin ice. I met his gaze steadily. No, you are. In that moment, I understood what I had to do. The evidence was gone. The drink was shattered. The letter had been turned against me. But there was one thing he hadn't planned for, one thing he couldn't control. Me, because for the first time I wasn't reacting. I wasn't playing his game. I was writing my own, and I was about to make my move. For the first time all night I felt calm, not because I was safe, but because I was finally thinking clearly. My son had spent his life perfecting his games, but every game has a flaw. His was simple. He needed control. He needed me to react. And now at last I wasn't reacting. I took a slow breath and turned to the officers. May I stand up? They glanced at each other, then nodded. Of course, I rose, sliding my chair back with a steady hand. My son's eyes followed me, narrowing slightly. He didn't like unpredictability. He didn't like change. I'm going to tell you what happened, I said, my voice even. And I'm going to do it once. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I raised a hand, palm outward, and for the first time in years he stopped. The power shift was almost visible in the air, like a change in pressure before a storm. I came here tonight because he invited me, I said to the officers. He ordered the wine, not me. The guard saw him add something. I don't know what it was. But what I do know is this. I paused, looking directly at my son. I'm done protecting him. The Dainus stirred. The officers straightened. The guard's eyes flickered with something like relief. My son tilted his head, his lips curving faintly. Protecting me? He echoed, almost amused. Yes, I said. Every time you hurt someone, every time you twisted the truth, I told myself you'd grow out of it. I covered for you. I made excuses, but not tonight. I turned to the officers again. You may not find poison. You may not have proof, but if you let him leave here tonight, he will keep doing this over and over. To me, to someone else. Silence blanketed the restaurant. And then I did something none of them expected. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I recorded everything, I said quietly. The words dropped like stones into a still pond. Gasps rippled. My son froze. I held up the phone. The guard's warning. The glass. His words. It's all here. A backup uploaded to the cloud the moment it started. Just in case, it wasn't entirely true. I hadn't recorded everything, but I had recorded enough. Our exchange about the wine, his reactions, his whispers. Enough to sow doubt, to fracture his narrative. The officers leaned forward. May we see it? Yes, I said. My fingers didn't tremble as I handed the phone over. My son's face changed in an instant. The smirk vanished. His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking near his temple. You planned this, he hissed under his breath. No, I whispered back. You did. You just didn't plan for me to stop playing. The officers stepped aside to watch the video. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the ceiling lights. My son sat perfectly still, but the tension radiating from him was a storm. As the video played, snippets of our conversation echoed back. My voice, the guard's warning, his insistence that I drink. His eyes flicked toward the screen, then back at me. When the officers finished, they didn't speak right away. They simply looked at him. And for the first time, I saw something I had never seen in their faces before. Not doubt, not pity, certainty. One of them stepped forward. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us. My son laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. On what charge? Attempted poisoning, the officer said evenly. And we'll let the lab decide the rest. He stood slowly, his hands raised slightly as though to show he wasn't resisting. But his eyes burned into me 2 points of fire. You think you've won? He whispered. I think I've survived, I said quietly. The officers led him toward the door. The diners watched in silence, some wide-eyed, some whispering. The guard stepped closer to me, his voice soft. You all right, ma'am? I nodded faintly. For the first time in a long time, I said, my voice trembling with exhaustion, but also with something like relief. My son paused at the door, turning his head just enough to look at me one last time. And then he smiled. Not the smirk, not the charm, but something darker. A promise, this isn't over, he murmured. And then he was gone. The restaurant seemed to exhale all at once. People returned to their meals, though quietly, casting glances my way. The guard stayed by my side until the officers disappeared with my son into the night. I sank back into my chair, the shattered glass still at my feet, the letter still on the table. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, but so did a strange, quiet sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer trapped inside his game, but as I stared at the door where he had vanished, I knew the story wasn't finished. Because monsters don't disappear when you turn the lights on. They retreat, they wait, and this was only the beginning of whatever came next. The restaurant staff swept up the glass, mopped away the red stains, and slowly the hum of conversation returned. People laughed again, clinked glasses, resumed their meals. For them, it was just a dramatic interruption to their evening, a story they might tell tomorrow at work, a bizarre memory that would fade with time. But for me, it wasn't just a moment. It was the culmination of years, of fear, of silence, of doubt. I sat there staring at the empty chair across from me. The faint warmth of the candle still flickered, the plate of food still untouched. And yet, it felt as if the entire restaurant had shifted on its axis. Because in that moment, I realized something I should have understood long ago. You cannot save someone who doesn't want to be saved. I had spent years trying, years pouring love into a well that had no bottom. Years excusing, covering, hoping, believing that if I just held on long enough, if I just gave enough, he would turn into the person I thought he could be. But the truth is, love cannot change a heart that refuses to soften. Compassion cannot fix cruelty when cruelty is chosen over and over again. And silence. Silence only feeds it. The hardest part wasn't admitting what he had done. The hardest part was admitting what I had allowed. That my fear, my excuses, my endless hope had given him the stage he needed to grow into something I could no longer control. And yet, even with that realization, I couldn't stop the ache in my chest. He was still my son, the boy I once rocked to sleep, the boy who clung to me during thunderstorms, the boy whose first word had been Mama. That boy was still there, somewhere beneath the monster he had become. But love, I finally understood, does not mean surrender. When I walked out of the restaurant that night, the autumn air was cool against my skin. The city lights flickered. Traffic hummed in the distance. Life went on. The guard walked me to my car, his presence steady, his silence comforting. "Thank you," I said softly. He shook his head. "Don't thank me. You did what needed to be done." His words lingered long after I drove away because he was right. For years I had been waiting for someone else to save me. From my son, from my fear, from myself. But in the end, it wasn't the guard or the police or the strangers in that restaurant who set me free. It was me. The choice to stand. The choice to speak. The choice to stop playing the game. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Love is powerful. But love without boundaries is a cage. Respect is vital. But respect given without question can become a weapon in the wrong hands. Character is not what someone shows the world when they are being watched. Character is what they do when no one is looking. And compassion, true compassion, sometimes means walking away. Sometimes it means saying enough. Sometimes it means letting go even when it breaks your heart. Because staying silent in the face of cruelty is not love. It is surrender. And surrender only feeds the darkness. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if my son will change, or if he will come back into my life with the same venom he carried that night. But I do know this. Whatever comes, I will no longer meet it with silence. I will meet it with truth, and sometimes that is the bravest thing we can do. So now I leave the question with you. What would you have done? Would you have believed the guard? Would you have drunk the wine? Would you have walked away? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. And if this story made you pause, made you think, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories to tell, more truths to uncover. Because in the end, stories aren't just words, they are mirrors. And sometimes when we least expect it, they show us who we are.